Hello, everyone. My name is Tiffany Trent. Recently, I recorded a live Q&A with Terri Windling, and I wanted to share that video with you. And there was some technical difficulty, so unfortunately, some of the very first parts where I did the introduction for Terri are missing. So I'm going to recap that really quickly for you. Terri is a 9-time World Fantasy Award winning author, winner of the Mythopoeic Award, so many awards, and a well known editor. She edited many of the year's best fantasy and horror, and with Ellen Datlow, and also many authors that you love and know were edited by Terri early in her career. She is also a consummate artist and a real advocate for the earth and for the power of folklore and myth and story. I wanted to talk to her about The Woodwife because I feel it's such a foundational book. And the first question that I asked Terri was how she found herself in the desert. And unfortunately, the very beginning part cut off where she talks about she ended up in Tucson as part of a healing journey from medical issues that she had suffered. And she wasn't expecting to be there at all. And so, as part of that healing, the desert sort of opened her up in so many ways. And as we join the part where she's answering the question, she's talking at this point about how the desert gave her the art that she now carries and sort of solidified her voice as an artist and a writer. So I hope you enjoy this, and thank you for everyone who came and stuck with us. And we hope to do this again. So I hope you'll join us the next time. Thank you.
I also felt like I had written before I wrote The Woodwife. I'd written things and published things, and I had certainly painted before I got to the desert, but nothing. I never felt like I was certain who I was as either a writer or painter. I was I constantly felt like I was in the footsteps of other people and not as good as them. I was in the footsteps of the pre-Raphaelites, and I was nowhere near as good as them, and never would be. Or people like Brian Froud and Alan Lee. And as a writer, there were so many people doing both fantasy writing and realistic novel writing that I just couldn't see how they were already doing the things that I love so well. I couldn't see a place for myself. And I wonder if there are writers and artists out there who can relate to this. When you're young and you don't know what your style it is. You kind of know what you want to say, but you just can't find a way in. Like, where is my place? What do I have to say that's different than everybody else? What do I have to put on the page as a painting that's different than
Kind of
everybody else?
like Maggie in the book, you sort of came into yourself when you were there.
Yeah. And it was shocking that it wasn't even coming to Dartmoor so much as going to the desert that gave me the piece of the puzzle I needed, even though there is obviously a strong part of me that's Dartmoorian, and this is where I finally settled down. I needed that desert part of the puzzle before it all clicked into place, and I suddenly knew what I wanted to write about. I knew how I wanted to paint. It was extraordinary. And I think of all the years before that, trying so hard to find my story, find my vision.
Right.
And sometimes you just have to wait for life to bring you to the place and the time
Right.
where it comes. I couldn't have found it until life brought me to the desert
I brought you
through
to.
all those weird coincidences. Beth moving to Tucson, my surviving cancer, all those things that came together to just push me to a place that I never even considered being. That proved to be so artistically essential.
Yeah. Janet has a really good question over in the chat about wondering if whether the healing you were led to seek opened you up to find that doorway. Um, I think that's an ex
Question.
yeah.
That is a really good question because Yes, I would say absolutely.
Mhm.
There is a shamanic journey you go on when you heal, to use a used word. I know we can define shamanic very, but you go into the underworld. I'm using that in mythic terms.
Mhm.
When you're going through any kind of big healing, but even small healings, you go into the underworld and your bones are ripped from flesh and then you're put back together then and you emerge with gifts from that terrible journey, and you're very open to new ways of being. There's stories in which when you come back from the underworld, you have to take on a new name, and you relearn how to speak and how
Mhm.
to cook and how to dress yourself. um, it did feel like going through that particular journey with ovarian uterine cancer was that sort of a journey. So coming to Tucson and having to lie very still for a while, and to be in that place where everything was stripped from me, all
Uh-huh.
my ideas were stripped from me. I was just a person healing. Yeah, absolutely. Did allow something new to enter and change me. It's one of the extraordinary gifts of trauma. If you see it in a mythic sense, any kind of trauma can also give you the opportunity. I wouldn't seek trauma to go through the doorway this way, but it is one of the great gifts of surviving a trauma, is that it it does so strip you bare that those doors do open.
Mhm. I
So
think,
that's
I,
an insightful question.
yeah, that is a very insightful question. Thank you. One thing I was thinking too is about Maggie's journey in the book is a lot like that in terms of the fact that she's closed herself down in a lot of ways. She's suffered something of a loss with her divorce.
Yeah.
And but
I
yet,
was also a loss with the marriage itself. She
yeah,
lost her in that
yeah,
marriage.
yeah. And she comes to the desert, not sure of what she thinks. But um, you know, it seems like you're talking about being broken open.
And Maggie was certainly broken open by the desert, and she was certainly healed by that landscape, but she had to break open and be very vulnerable and very real first. But I think in a way that's true with just about every main character. Every character in the book is has to face themselves, face their demons, do an inward journey to find out who they really are and who they choose to be, and henceforth. But Maggie, most of all, being the main character.
Nancy has a nice question. In chapter 7, Maggie tells Fox, art is the thing that matters to me. It's not the desire for fame that drives me, but to do good work, the best that I can. I want to leave something good behind me when I go, something that will last. And Fox replies in part, there's a difference between us and then immortality means nothing to me. Terri, who did you identify with more when you wrote that? And how's that changed now?
I probably identify more with Maggie, but I am driven to make art, and I do want to leave something behind that leaves the world slightly lighter. Whether I'm not in need of like huge amount of fame or success, but I would like to know that I did by my lights, work that felt good, that felt meaningful, that expressed the things about the magic of life in the land that I care about, the magic of community that I care about. Um, but I've known people like Fox who live their lives as artful as any self-proclaimed artist. So I think I liked the combination of Maggie being with someone who wasn't driven in the same way, that who was very content to just to live his life in a good way, in a very local way among the people he loved, and wasn't like her ex-husband, wasn't looking for fame, wasn't didn't need applause, was just living as a good person on the planet. There was a spur for that. When I first conceived the story of the Woodwife, a lot of different things and conversations went into it, as it does with any novel that any of us write. But I had had this funny conversation with an old friend, a guy who ref refused to believe that it was possible to create a viable, believable romance between what he called a high status woman and a man of lower status. He felt that that just didn't work as a romance, that the man always had to be more ambitious, more successful. I mean, it's such an old-fashioned point of view. And he was saying, I'm not saying in life that has to be true, but to create a romance, it just won't be believable if you've got this very dynamic woman and a guy who's, more homely, who's content with more homely things, and and isn't looking for fame and glory and doesn't make as much money. That, I could easily imagine a woman who was older, more successful, more ambitious, than her partner, and that it could be very romantic indeed. And I wanted to prove him wrong by writing that relationship.
Last night, Kelly Link gave this really cool talk to Southern New Hampshire University students. And she said in there that she has this love-hate relationship with with her writing, and she said, and I kind of wondered, but that the way that she kept going was that she was very stubborn, and I kind of wondered if you had the same relationship with your writing, or do you have a more sort of ecstatic relationship with your writing? I was just sort of curious about that.
I go back and forth. I have days when I just think I've forgotten how to write altogether, and the words on the page make no sense. And then I have days that are ecstatic, and there's never any rhyme or reason why one, for me, as far as I can tell. I can come in the morning and be all charged up to write and then have a horrible day. And it can be the reverse. I can be having tearing my hair out about other things going on and sit down and suddenly have a brilliant writing day. It's just, it's, it's, it's a thing of itself. I, I think my biggest challenge with writing is writing as a person with chronic illness, because while I've survived cancer, I have complications resulting from it that I've been dealing with ever since. And finding the energy to write, the while also maintaining all the things that you have to do to keep your life going, has been more of my struggle than when I get that energy and that time. I've learned to just get down and do it, whether it's an easy day or an ecstatic day, because I can't, my schedule is so out of my control sometimes. My body will do what it will do, or suddenly have, 20 million doctor's appointments and hospital appointments that I have to deal with. So I have to grab time when I can grab it, and when energy allows, and not get too fussed about whether I feel ecstatic or grumpy about writing.
Yeah.
So I say my big struggle really is that. And I'm sure there are people out there that can relate to that, how you create art from a body that doesn't always work.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
or whatever your personal challenge is, time interrupted by raising children, or, everybody has things that wrestle with the creative impulse. Finding that time. I don't know anyone who finds that easy. Even the most privileged among us have responsibilities. And to me, that's the biggest creative challenge. Those rare times when I can just go off on a retreat and have nothing to do but write are so blessed.
Yeah.
But that's not everyday living. Everyday living is getting it done in that hour you have between this doctor appointment and this, going down to check on your mother-in-law, and this is, it's
Yeah.
that's life in the modern world, and life being connected to family and community.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, thinking about that, I wrote Woodwife ages ago, and those main characters don't have kids.
Mhm.
They're not really wrestling with those kind of issues.
Yeah.
The book I'm reading now, there's much more of that.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, like, what is there something else that you would want that you might do now that you didn't do
Not
then?
in that story. That story was what it needed to
Yeah,
be at the time.
yeah,
But my life now is very different.
right.
I hadn't expected to become. I was more like Maggie in that I was very independent and single for a long time. And then I got married and suddenly had a teenager. Gave birth to a teenager. I became the
Yeah,
mother of a teenager, and life changed.
yeah.
Life, community life. And so those are concerns that have woven into the book that I'm writing now, which is loosely connected to the Woodwife, but it's not a sequel in that it takes place over here on Dartmoor and in Victorian times. But definitely it is again about women in the arts and magic and fairies and all that stuff that is in the Woodwife, basically, even though they're not called fairies. But it is interesting that my older experience of life as being much more networked with people of all ages and the responsibilities that come with that is more a part of this book and women's lives in this book.
Yeah. Has that changed? I know you're working on the Moonwife now. Has that kind of fed into what you're working on with the Moonwife?
Yeah, a lot more than I expected.
One thing too, I wondered if you could talk about is sort of the predator prey relationship here. There's, some characters have to die.
Yeah. Are we trying not to say who? I assume everybody who's here has read
Yeah,
it.
yeah, I assume so too, but I just sort of wondered about how you felt about including that, or how you how you felt about uh keeping that putting that cycle in a book that maybe some people weren't sort of anticipating, you know
Well,
um
I wasn't anticipating it myself. I'm not somebody who plots out books in advance. I know
mhm,
the rough arcs, but I write it, I discover it as I go along. And it was clear that somebody would, what big magics like the releasing of the Night Mage, have to be paid for. There was going to be life and death in that final sequence, but I didn't know who or how.
mhm,
And I thought it was possible that we might lose Dora, that
yeah.
Juan might be
I was worried.
so far away, so far gone that he would lose the thing that mattered most to him, that we'd lose her. Um, but it wasn't. It was it was the most innocent character in the book. And
Mhm,
it was casual, the way evil often is. She was target practice, but she was not Dora. I mean, the one who did die. I'm avoiding the name.
yeah,
There's people
I'm
that read it. But the her death was casual to the person who did it. That wasn't even what he was out there to hunt. And in my experience, and I've unfortunately have some real experience in my younger life of what I would call certainly with a foot in evil. It tends to be that casual and that banal.
Yeah.
And I hated that scene. I hated writing it. When I realized that's where the story was leading, I just I didn't want to go there, but every other avenue was false. That was where it needed to go. And I hated it and I still hate it. But it is
Part
the
of life.
and part of myth and part of land magic isn't all lovely. You know,
Yeah.
myth and relation with whatever you want to call spirits, fairies, land spirits, whatever, those stories aren't safe. And innocents do die. And magic is paid
That's
for
what I
in
loved
sometimes
about it.
horrible ways. And
I love that so much that it's not safe.
it's not safe.
Mhm.
And it felt right that it was actually the most painful for me, that was the most painful character to lose. And
Me too.
and life, unfortunately, is like that too. It's not just things working out well in the end. It's also that. And it's horrible. And it's beautiful. And it's everything in between.
Yes. Yes. I want to say more about that scene, but I'm not going to, just in case. Just in case. There's some.
But I didn't enjoy writing that. I did not enjoy writing that. I wasn't like sitting there thinking, oh, I'm going to evoke some emotion here. I hated it. But I don't know, it was where the story needed to go. It was, I couldn't go in any other direction would have been false.
I think that's something that I really appreciated very much was that you weren't shy. You didn't shy away from doing what needed to be done. And that can be really hard as an artist and a writer and all that kind of stuff to try to um you know to do that because uh sometimes you just don't want to do those things, like you said.
And so often, particularly in fantasy, where we're dealing with these archetypal themes and we're dealing with mythic themes, sometimes death and sacrifice and that end of the cycle of myth can be presented in such heroic terms. And my experience of having coming out of a very harsh family background and some very hard experiences is that death isn't always heroic. Sometimes it is casual. It's stupid. You think, why the hell did that happen? It is meaningless. While at the same time being full of meaning. Why this character? Why this casually? Why? That has been my experience over several hard things in my life. That it's not my experience that death is heroic, that violent death or violent trauma is heroic.
Right.
So I needed to be true also to my experience. It wasn't going to be a big, wonderful sacrifice. It wasn't going to be Thomas Yazi sacrificing himself for the greater good, or it wasn't going to be anything like that. It was going to be just a waste.
Yeah.
It's not that I also portrayed Thomas as a hunter. I grew up with hunting folk. It's not that hunting for subsistence is wrong. Hunting in a respectful manner is necessarily wrong.
Right.
But violence, casual violence, and violence without thought, I think, is one of the worst things a human being can do.
Can see it in the coyotes that are, running around, and the way that Maggie notices and engages with them. you know um I thought her compassion was interesting. I really liked the fact that she had such great compassion for what she was seeing around her, um instead of backing away from it. you know
Mm.
I was thinking about how the characters, are just sort of, um they're ordinary people, you know but then as you get into the book, you find out all these extraordinary things about them and all these extraordinary relationships, and then toward the end things become, mythic, transcendent. And I guess, I was like, how did you do that? But that may not even be a question you can answer. I don't know. It's just, it may be too hard to answer that.
Yeah, like I said, I don't plot books out. I had some characters I wanted to write about. I had some themes I wanted to write about. The major ones being seduction by landscape. And um and I wanted to talk about women's art. So there are actually, should I live so long, there are actually 5 books in this sequence. And I'm gonna have to write a hell of a lot faster than I'm writing now to get them all done. So the Moonwife is number 2, and they sort of jump around in time. But they're all, what they share is a connection to the tales of the land and how, how they affect our lives. And because it's fantasy, you can personify the way your relationship to the land affects your lives by creating spirits of the land. If this was realist writing, you could do the same thing in a metaphorical way, just having the land as a strong presence in your story. But what's lovely about fantasy is we get to turn that relationship into actual characters and intermediaries and magical beings. But so I wanted to talk about that, about our relationship with various strong kinds of landscape and its stories and how that shapes us and how we in turn shape those stories that go back into the land. And then I wanted to talk about the lives of women writers. And and then I just fed into it all the things I was thinking about in those years, where looking at all my girlfriends and the ways that when you're in your 20s and your 30s, it's so easy to have your love life dominate everything. And somebody, when you're doing like writer Q&As, so a common question is, if you could tell your younger self, what to do differently, for me it'd be like, stop focusing on your damn love life and just work. That particularly for women in this culture. I mean, we live in a culture that in all our pop songs and everything, part really has a fetish about romance. And I'm not saying that romance isn't lovely, but for women especially, we're judged by how successfully, do we have a partner? Have we been successful? Who are we connected to? And it's hard not to internalize that and to really focus on that when you're young and hormones are flowing but I would tell my younger self, spend a little less time worrying about that and being involved with that and the ups and downs of that, and more time just in your studio working. And so I wanted to show that too, how women, strong, feminist, creative women like Maggie is, like Dora is, just get derailed by their love lives. Even like Dora, Juan was a good guy before the flood mage came along. It's not that that was a bad marriage before that, but she still got derailed from, she was so concerned about making sure his art was happening that she was working at a little desk in the kitchen and he had a whole barn. I saw in my 20s and 30s, and now I come from, I grew up I came of age in the 70s. I was in uni in the 70s and then was a young adult in New York and Boston in the 80s. So I'm a different generation than some of the people here. But in our generation, I just watch so many of my women friends give so much of their time, their love, their energy, their power away to the men they were involved with.
Oh, it kept going past the 70s. I'll just I'll just say that.
And it
That
wasn't necessarily the fault of the men. I mean, some of these were really good guys, but
yeah,
we were raised to do that. We
we
were
were
raised.
raised, yeah, we were raised to do that. I mean, that's yeah, that and I saw that in Dora and Juan, and it really bothered me, like, why? I mean, I was glad ultimately I was worried. I was at first worried that things were really gonna get a lot darker than they did. I mean, they were pretty dark in some spaces, but then I was worried it was gonna get a lot worse. And I was like, oh no, just feeling that that the synergy with her of what that was like, where you're trying to hold up an entire household
Yeah.
mostly on your own, um,
And
is I felt such great sympathy for that character.
and even Cooper and Davis Cooper and they he absolutely believed in her art in an era, in the 40s and 30s and 40s and 50s where that wasn't common. But he also expected her to put dinner on the table.
Yeah, yeah,
It
exactly. I mean, he expected her to do all these things and to put up with when he had these temper tantrums, and he's going through these existential crises about his art, which, you know, one does sometimes suffer through, but not everybody has to suffer with you, you
I
know?
don't, I don't think these things sound very revelatory today, but
Yeah.
at the
But at the
yeah,
time, that was huge.
I
But I
was
think it's
just
still happening.
desperate to read biographies of women and know about women artists and women writers and their lives. And it was still so hard to find. And I didn't, in novels, I wasn't finding these kind of concerns. And yet I was watching so many women around me going through this stuff. And so the one I'm working on now, which Moonlight, which is, oh, thank God, almost done, is set in Victorian times. It looks at some of the roots of these things
Mhm.
that are still plaguing them, Bedora and Maggie in the 1990s, looking at the attitudes in Victorian times that we still struggle with today, all these years later. I'm looking at look at this kind of area where fantasy and nature writing meet.
Mhm.
What other books do you think fall in that category? I'm putting you on the spot here,
You
or anybody else out there, if you have an ideas of
yeah,
like mythological.
yeah.
Robert Holdstock, Wood absolutely does.
Hold stock. Um, Scott Russell Sanders gave it a go with a couple of things that he did. Um, one of those was Terrarium, which was it seems to me like nature writers, if they're going to venture into a more fantastic area, tend to go towards science fiction and dystopia, or just dealing with the ecological consequences of certain things. So Scott Russell Sanders did that with Terrarium. I don't see a whole lot of people doing what you did, where you're celebrating and sort of taking us on this mythic journey at the same time that you're talking about a landscape. I don't see that as often. I see a lot of, say, some nature writers will kind of give you an aside about cultural or mythical significance of this or that, but I don't ever see them jumping into that pool as easily. I mean,
You see it in magic realism sometimes, like some of the
yeah,
Native American writers, like Louise
yes,
Eric and
yes,
Linda Hunt, go into that intersection of land and magic, but they would probably object to those books being described as fantasy.
yes. I think so.
So, like, who
That's
is doing the fantasy field? I want
yeah,
to know.
yeah. I would like to know too. I mean, I see some people trying to approach landscape a lot more in their fantasy, but I don't see it as a primary focus. Um,
Joyce, um, um, Graham Joyce did it in his book, The Limits of Enchantment. That's about
That I've
hedge magic in the 50s. The landscape and the magic of the landscape is a big theme there. I'm really looking for recommendations here.
yeah, I'm trying to do that in the book I'm working on now called Owl Woman.
Why
Uh,
does that not surprise me?
about I'm writing, I think it's probably going to be YA, but I'm not really sure. But it's about the destruction and sort of the mythic significance of the destruction of Dolly Sod's
Mm.
wilderness area in West Virginia,
Mm.
which used to harbor some of our only sort of red spruce boreal forests because it was high enough. And every explorer who came into it um, talked about it as a tangled wilderness, and like it had just been unexplored. And I put air quotes around that because there were people who had moved through there before. But then when they found out there was no coal, they just started taking down the spruce for lumber. And there were all these amazing animals that were living there in the moss around the spruce. And I've just been enchanted with that ever since. And don't don't laugh, but I attended this conference several years ago, the Eastern Hellbender Conference, and it was a bunch of biologists who were trying to figure out how best to preserve the Eastern Hellbender, which is the largest salamander in the
Mm.
eastern streams. And the Eastern Hellbender was used to be there, but is no longer there because of all the stuff that happened. So I take the woodwife as kind of this, shining example of what I'm kind of hoping I can do with Owl Woman. We'll just see. But I don't know if anybody, I mean, I'm sure there are people doing it. And again, native writers are a whole other thing unto themselves.
Are good with landscape in their stories, like well, some of the classics like Alan Garner
Yes.
with landscape, or more recently people like Jane Lynn Skoll, writing imaginary worlds and also in this world with animals and the landscape. There are,
I'm going
but
to
I'm
put
trying to think
that in.
of stories where the landscape is itself almost a character,
Yes.
like Robert Holdstock.
Like,
Mythology
yes.
is all about that wood.
Yes. Yes. I agree. We'll think about it. I need to make a list clearly. Because in all my like eco literature, we were always just strictly reading nature writers. We generally didn't read with an eye toward the fantastic or the mythic.
I have a theory, and I'd like to test it out, that there are places that as fantasists we can go that nature writers can't in
Yes.
order to connect people with nature.
Mhm.
Not that it's better or worse, but it's a different route.
Mhm.
Fantasy writers who use landscape magnificently, like Le Guin and the Earthsea books, and
Yes, I think that's, some of my frustration with nature writing. I ultimately got really frustrated with it at one point, was just it felt so formulaic in some ways, and it felt like there was an element that I wanted to explore more. And so I think that maybe fantasy is the way to do that,
yeah,
So
it's worth exploring.
yes,
It's worth talking about, worth thinking about who's heading in that direction, what we can learn from them.
yes, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you all again. Thank you, Terri, for your patience and your perseverance. All right. Take care. I will talk to you soon.
Thank
Bye.
you everyone for coming.
Yep,
Bye.
thank you.